I was 7 months pregnant, sitting across from my father-in-law at the kitchen table of the house my husband and I had shared for 6 years, when he slid a manila envelope toward me and said, "Sign this before the baby comes. It'll be cleaner that way." My husband was standing by the window. He didn't turn around. "My name is Leah Sutton. I'm 34 years old. I live in Mississauga, Ontario, and on the day this happened, I was wearing the same gray maternity sweater I'd worn 3 days in a row because nothing else fit anymore and I had stopped caring. I should have been at my prenatal yoga class. Instead, I was watching my father-in-law tap the envelope like it was a routine piece of paperwork. I thought I already knew what the worst moment of my life felt like. I was wrong. Let me go back a little. My husband, Colin, and I met at university in Toronto. He was finishing his MBA. I was in my final year of nursing school. We were introduced through mutual friends at a Thanksgiving dinner in someone's tiny annex apartment, and he spent the whole meal asking me questions instead of talking about himself, which I thought was rare enough to be interesting. We dated for 2 years, got engaged, got married in a small ceremony at Rattlesnake Point, and built what I genuinely believed was a good life. Not perfect. Real. We argued about whose turn it was to call the insurance company. We disagreed about whether to buy the house in Mississauga or wait for something in Hamilton. Small things. The kind of things that feel irritating in the moment and completely insignificant in memory. When I found out I was pregnant, Colin cried. Happy tears. He called his mother from the hospital parking lot before we even got home. That's the version of my husband I keep coming back to. The man standing in the hospital parking lot in February, crying into his phone because we were having a baby. I need to hold on to that version because the one who appeared 3 months into my pregnancy was someone I didn't recognize. It started small. He stopped initiating conversations at dinner. He started working later, texting less, coming to bed after I was already asleep. I told myself it was the pressure of the new project his company had taken on. His father, Don, had built the family's commercial HVAC business from nothing in the 80s, and Colin had joined the company 5 years earlier. There was always pressure. I had learned to read the difference between regular work stress and something more serious, and for a long time I told myself this was just the regular kind. Then one evening in March, he sat down across from me while I was eating leftover soup and said, "I think we need to talk about separating." I put down my spoon. "I'm 7 weeks pregnant," I said, as if he might have forgotten. He nodded, like I had confirmed something he already knew. I asked every question I could think of. Was there someone else? No. Was it something I had done? He said it wasn't. Was it the pregnancy itself? He said no. He wanted the baby. Then what? What was the reason? He just shook his head and said he was sorry, that he didn't know how to explain it, that things had changed. Things had changed. That was all I got. For weeks after that conversation, I searched. I looked through credit card statements for hotel charges. I checked his location history on the family plan. I went through 7 years of our life looking for the crack I must have missed. I found nothing. No affair. No gambling. No second phone. Nothing that explained why the man I had built a life with was suddenly treating our marriage like a lease he had decided not to renew. Meanwhile, his parents started coming around more. His mother, Helen, called me twice a week with an energy I can only describe as carefully managed concern. She brought me casseroles I didn't want and sat on my couch asking about my sleep and my blood pressure, and the whole time I had the sense she was measuring something. Monitoring. His father, Don, was different. Don had always been quietly kind to me in the way of men from his generation who show love through practicality. He fixed things that needed fixing. He showed up when I asked for help and didn't overstay. But during those weeks, he started avoiding my eyes. I noticed that too late. Colin filed the paperwork in April. His lawyer sent mine a standard separation agreement. The terms were fair, actually, more than fair. The family home, my share of joint savings. A parenting arrangement that gave me primary residence with generous access for him. A lawyer friend of mine looked it over and said someone had clearly told his side to be reasonable. That stuck with me at the time, but I didn't know what to do with it. I asked Colin once more, the night before I was supposed to sign. We were sitting in the kitchen, the same kitchen where he had cried when I showed him the positive test. I asked him to look at me and tell me honestly that this was what he wanted. He looked at me, and then he looked away. "Let's just get through this," he said. The next morning, I drove to the lawyer's office in downtown Mississauga. I sat in a beige chair across from two lawyers and a notary and a table of documents. Colin arrived 20 minutes late. He didn't apologize. He sat down and opened his portfolio, like we were here to finalize a mortgage. The lawyer reviewed the documents. She explained each section. My hands were in my lap, pressed flat against my thighs, because if I put them on the table, I wasn't sure they would stay still. I kept thinking about the drive to the hospital in February, how Colin had run 3 red lights because he was so excited and hadn't noticed, how we had laughed about it afterward, how he had held my hand the entire drive home and talked about names, about the nursery, about whether we should get a dog before or after the baby arrived. "Miss Sutton." The lawyer slid a page toward me. "If you're ready." I looked down at the signature line. Colin was already holding his pen, and then the door opened. Don walked in without knocking. He was wearing his work jacket, the one with the company logo on the chest, and he had clearly come straight from a job site. His boots were dirty. There was a streak of grease on his forearm. He looked like a man who had been pacing a parking lot for an hour, working up the nerve to come inside, which I later learned was exactly what he had been doing. Colin stood up. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Don didn't answer him. He looked at me first, just for a second. An apology in his eyes before he had said a single word. Then he turned to his son, and he said, "Stop, just stop. I can't watch you do this." Colin's jaw tightened. "Dad, this is not the place." "I know what place it is." Don's voice wasn't loud. It was controlled, which was somehow worse. "I know exactly what place it is, and I should have spoken up 3 months ago, but your mother—" He stopped. He pressed his hand flat on the table. "Your mother made me promise not to. And I kept that promise too long." I looked at Colin. He had gone pale. Don reached into the inside pocket of his work jacket and pulled out a folded set of documents. He set them on the table in front of the lawyer. "I need you to look at these," he said. She hesitated. She looked at Colin's lawyer, who looked at Colin, who was staring at his father with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between fury and relief. Like a man watching someone cut a knot he had been unable to untangle himself. "Don?" Colin said quietly. "You don't have to do this." "I do," Don said. "I do because she deserves to know why." He turned to me then. And what he said next rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last 4 months of my life. 18 months earlier, Don had begun to notice irregularities in the company's accounts. Not dramatic ones. Small ones. The kind that are easy to explain away if you're not looking carefully. A vendor invoice that didn't match. A deposit that came in 2 days later than the paperwork indicated. Line items that technically within the range of error, but that appeared consistently in the same category. He brought it to his bookkeeper first. She couldn't explain it. He hired an outside accountant. That accountant found more. Over a period of 14 months, approximately $340,000 had been moved out of the company's operating accounts through a series of transfers that had been structured specifically to stay below the threshold that would trigger automatic reporting under Canada's Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act. Someone who knew the system had done this deliberately. That someone was Helen, his wife, Colin's mother. Don's voice didn't shake when he said it. He had clearly rehearsed this part. Or maybe he had just said it enough times to himself in the dark that it no longer surprised him. I heard the lawyer beside me set down her pen. Helen had been managing the company's administrative accounts since the late 90s. She had signing authority. She had access. She had also, Don had eventually discovered, been secretly supporting her brother's failing restaurant business in Burlington for over a year. A business she had never told Don about, a debt she had promised to cover, using money she did not have. a problem she had solved by quietly draining from the company she had helped build. When Colin found out, not from Dawn, but on his own, when he noticed a discrepancy on a quarterly report he wasn't supposed to review, he had confronted her privately. He hadn't told me. He hadn't told Dawn. He had tried to handle it the way his mother asked him to. Quietly, internally, as a family matter. And then Helen had told him that if the investigation became public, the company would be frozen pending review. Dawn would face scrutiny as the registered owner. And the resulting media attention in a community where the family had operated for 4 decades would be devastating. She told him that separating from me temporarily would remove me from the liability radius, that it would protect me. That once everything was resolved quietly, they could explain everything and rebuild. She had convinced her own son to dismantle his marriage in order to preserve her secret. I sat very still. Colin was looking at the table. She told me it was the safest way, he said. His voice was almost inaudible. She said 6 months. She said it would all be over in 6 months, and I could tell you everything and we could. He stopped. He pressed his fingers against his eyes. I know how it sounds. It sounds, I said slowly, like you chose to protect her over telling me the truth. He didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't one. Dawn spread the documents on the table. The accountant's report, bank statements, transfer records, a letter from the firm that had been conducting the quiet investigation. He had brought everything. The lawyers looked at each other. Colin's lawyer asked for a few minutes to review. Dawn sat down heavily in the chair beside me, as if he had been standing for a very long time and could finally rest. I'm sorry, he said to me. Not to Colin. To me. I should have told you sooner. She's my wife, and I kept hoping she'd find a way to tell the truth herself. I thought I was giving her time. I was just giving her more time to let this continue. I didn't know what to say to him. I looked at my husband across the table, the man who had once run 3 red lights because he was so excited about becoming a father. The man who had apparently spent 4 months doing exactly what his mother told him to do, including destroying the thing I needed most, because he was afraid of what would happen if he didn't. Why didn't you just tell me? I asked. It was the only question that mattered. Whatever was happening with the company, with your mother, why couldn't you just tell me? Colin's eyes were red. He had not cried, but he looked like a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time. Because I was ashamed, he said. And because I thought I could fix it. And because every time I was about to tell you, she'd call and remind me what was at stake, and he exhaled. I kept taking the easier route. And the easier route was destroying everything. The lawyer asked if we needed a recess. I said yes. We spent 40 minutes in a small meeting room down the hall. Just Colin and me and 2 cups of coffee that went cold. We didn't touch each other, but we talked. For the first time in 4 months, we actually talked. Not past each other, not in the managed way we'd been communicating since March, but honestly, with the kind of exhausted directness that only exists when there is nothing left to protect. He told me everything. The first discrepancy he found, the confrontation with his mother, the way she had cried and begged and told him that if it came out it would kill his father, which was manipulative and untrue, and part of him had known that even then. The lawyers she had quietly retained. The plan she had convinced him was temporary. I told him that I had spent 4 months believing I had done something wrong. That I had spent 4 months looking for an explanation inside myself. That I had told my prenatal care team I was experiencing situational anxiety, and they had prescribed me things I didn't want to take because I was pregnant. And I had laid awake for nights counting all the ways I must have failed him. Colin said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, I didn't know that. You didn't ask, I said. The lawyers met with both of us together after the recess. The separation agreement was withdrawn, pending review of the new evidence. There would be separate proceedings related to the company accounts. Dawn had already engaged a forensic accountant and was cooperating with a review. That was no longer something any of us could control. The CRA review had already been triggered by the outside accountant's report 3 weeks earlier. Helen, it turned out, already knew. She had been interviewed. She had retained her own counsel. The situation was no longer quiet, no matter what she had told Colin. Everything she had told him to protect had already started unraveling before he ever walked into that lawyer's office. I drove home alone that afternoon. I sat in the driveway for a long time. The nursery was almost finished. We had painted it a soft green because we wanted something that wasn't gendered, something that would grow with a child. Colin had spent a Saturday in February assembling the crib, while I sat on the floor, handing him pieces and reading instructions badly on purpose to make him laugh. I thought about that afternoon a lot in the weeks after. Colin moved back into the house 2 weeks later, not smoothly, not easily. There was too much between us for anything to be smooth or easy. I was angry in ways I hadn't fully let myself be yet. Not just at what he had done, but at how willing he had been to listen to his mother over me, how thoroughly she had been able to convince him that I was someone to be managed rather than trusted. That took a long time to work through. It still isn't finished. I'm not sure it ever will be completely. Our daughter was born 6 weeks after the signing meeting. That didn't happen. She was born at Credit Valley Hospital at 3:14 in the morning, 7 pounds and 11 ounces, and she screamed the moment she arrived, which the midwife said was an excellent sign. Colin was there. He had been there the entire labor, 12 hours, never leaving the room. I was still furious at him, and I was glad he was there. And both of those things were true at the same time, and that's the most honest thing I can say about where we were. Don came to the hospital the following afternoon. He held his granddaughter for a long time without speaking. When he handed her back, his eyes were wet. "She looks like you," he said to me. I thanked him for what he had done, not just in the lawyer's office, for caring enough to show up when it would have been easier not to. He had kept his wife's secret for months, and I understood why. Loyalty and love, and the particular kind of paralysis that comes from discovering something terrible about someone you have built your life around. But he had chosen to stop. When the moment came that mattered most, he had chosen to stop. That choice had given me back something I didn't know I was about to lose permanently. The legal proceedings involving the company accounts resolved over the following year. Helen repaid the full amount as part of a negotiated settlement. There was no criminal prosecution in the end, though it was seriously considered. The business survived. Don restructured the signing authorities and brought in an independent financial controller. He and Helen are still married, which I understand and also find complicated, and I've stopped trying to resolve that contradiction because it isn't mine to resolve. Colin and I went to counseling. We still go. Some sessions are easier than others. There are things I have forgiven him for, and things I am still working on forgiving, and a good therapist helped me understand that those two categories don't need to exist on the same timeline. Progress isn't linear. Neither is trust. What I know is this. On the day I sat in that beige chair with a pen in my hand, and my whole future contracting around me, I was one signature away from believing a story that wasn't true. A story in which I wasn't wanted. A story in which I had somehow been insufficient for the life I thought I was living. The truth was never that story. It took a man in muddy work boots walking into a room where he hadn't been invited to make sure I knew that. I think about that moment more than I probably should. The way Don looked at me before he said anything. The apology in his eyes. He didn't save my marriage that afternoon. He couldn't do that. That was work Colin and I had to do ourselves, slowly and imperfectly over months. But he gave us the chance to start. He gave me back the truth, and the truth gave me back the ground to stand on. The rest of it, we figured out together.